Hello. I am trying something new this time. At least for me, it's something of an experiment. I am having someone on with me to talk over a certain topic while we just play chess. It's unscripted, sort of semi-casual. In this case, I will be talking with Soapbar, who has played Left 4 Dead with me previously, and we've talked a lot. We've known each other for a while outside of this space. And we are talking about superhero adaptions and some of the tangents that sort of come along with that. Hopefully, this will be interesting. It might turn out something almost like a podcast type thing where what we're actually doing, like our game on screen, isn't really all that important as much as just us talking. Either way, I hope this turns out well and that you can enjoy it. All right. So, as I was talking about, just casually playing chess and talking about something, and we've been talking about superhero stuff recently,
Yep.
and
Okay, I can't drag.
I'm going to mute that tab. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and we ended up talking a lot about the Civil War story,
Yes.
and particularly, and while I don't want to get into something quite that heavy, especially something that you know, pretty well ticks me off, but talking about just adaptions in general, especially with superhero stories and how we get some interesting things that happen with adaptions in superhero stories. One of the main things that this sort of occurs to me is that a lot of things in superhero comics, because of how long they've been running and how many people end up contributing to it, that there ends up being a lot of characterizations that is kind of a degree of, depending on the writer, you know, characters have different nuances, different ideas. Um, One that I've heard a few things about, especially, is like Captain America. Like
Yeah.
in his own book, uh, he's usually portrayed very smart, very, uh, obviously as a good leader, but also he's usually not portrayed as like having blind faith in the government. Like, he's usually like very critical. Um, but that in other heroes' books, he's sometimes portrayed as very, uh, like almost blindly obedient to the government. That doesn't.
Yeah. Um, it's also a sort of running joke that Steve Rogers, usually there's been a lot of Avengers versus X-Men events question marks, and Steve usually ends up getting written to have like weird opinions about mutants, just so the writers can force a conflict.
Yeah, I think that is actually like something that actually like kind of really that I hear it and it sort of brings up and it kind of weirds me out just a bit where I will hear about other superheroes not getting along with the X-Men or like never sticking up for mutants and such. But what is always kind of weird to me because like I feel like um, most superheroes outside of the oh right, I can't castle out of check. That's what's going on.
Yeah.
Took me a moment to realize what was going on. But like
Yeah.
most superheroes, like just on a general for usually some very obvious reasons would not be racist. So it
Yeah.
doesn't make a lot of sense for but that's also just something that kind of becomes a problem in terms of like having this very long running storyline, and like you can't change the status quo too much. You can't actually have things get better for mutants, otherwise, uh, the main concept of the story doesn't work. Which is also one of those things where I think like an adaptation gets to do something that the main storyline, that the comic books can't, which is actually kind of have an actual resolution.
Yeah,
Um, I think about like the Nolan, oh geez, the Nolan Batman movies, which whatever opinion you may have on The Dark Knight Rises, at least got to have a resolution for Bruce. Uh,
yeah.
I am rusty.
I don't know. Yeah.
um,
Um,
which you just
that
can't do in the
is,
comics.
yeah. Especially Marvel, um, has this problem because Marvel and DC sort of have different philosophies on how to maintain their eternal product. DC does, they had the New 52 and Crisis on Infinite Earths, so these universe resets. Um, Marvel has what's called the sliding timescale, which is like, oh yeah, Spider-Man began in like the 1950s, but things have sort of been passively retconned so that it's always taking place in like current day,
Yeah,
which causes some weird problems. And getting back to the X-Men, it causes weird problems for like Magneto because Magneto's backstory is
tied.
very
Yeah, it's tied to World War II.
intensely tied to World War II. So they've had to like go back and say, "Oh yeah, Magneto's got the ability to live like forever, essentially."
Yeah, we have to slow down his aging so that he can still actually be doing things in the 2000s.
Mm.
Even though the idea of like once Magneto reaches a certain age, he needs to magnetically move himself around in a floating chair like Xavier would be a really interesting. It would look funny, but also be like an actual interesting image, as a juxtaposition. If that makes
Yeah,
sense, I don't know. That may only make sense inside my head. But
I
yeah,
think
it like I said with the X Men, like the consistent uh, not having things move forward means that the X Men are kind of stuck, which like actually presents a problem with its with the actual philosophy behind the
yeah,
X Men. It's kind of like the same thing that happens with Batman. Like, well, Batman's not actually changing anything because the status quo has been the same for
yeah,
forever. But that's not like a legitimate argument because what forces the status quo isn't actually a natural consequence of what Batman's trying to do. It's just how comic books work.
I
He
didn't realize
can't.
it was my move.
Yeah, he's like not allowed to actually make progress.
Yeah. Although I had heard an interesting um defense of the X-Men because the X-Men, the mutant allegory for prejudice and all
Yeah,
that. And I did see a little bit of an interesting defense saying that that actually kind of does work for the X-Men because it's like,
because it gets to remain a consistent allegory for
yeah,
any
and
kind of
because
discrimination.
prejudice in the real world is also kind of an infinite problem,
Yeah,
at least as far as we know right now.
yeah, it is an actual psychological thing that we inherently compare ourselves to other people, and Therefore, differences are going to uh, be a big part of what's in your mind when you're looking or interacting with other people, and there's really not anything you can do to get rid of that.
Yeah, it's also because of um I mean, this has been a debated thing, but like a sort of mistake with the X-Men that they're meant to be an allegory, for prejudice, but in real life, most prejudice is not based in rationality. It's usually the prejudice comes first and the rationalization happens later. With mutants, there's a lot of mutants who are like apocalyptic
Yeah,
threats. A
yeah.
million times they've had to deal with Phoenix.
Well, Phoenix. Well, I mean, Jean's immune. The Phoenix Force is something
Yeah,
else
the Phoenix
entirely.
Force is something else, but
the,
there's
the
also
Phoenix
that
Force is an eldritch. Is almost an eldritch horror. It's
there's
not
also
supposed
that
to be, but its interaction with humanity is.
there's also that X-Men comic that people like to talk about with the teenage mutant who abruptly manifests his powers and ends up like melting everybody around him.
Yeah, and like those are almost. The thing is, like that's also like one of the things about I was going to say about like inconsistencies across big time is that you have writers come in with very different ideas of how to present mutants, and so like there is like a level of inconsistency where like we've got one guy on the team whose entire mutation is that he has wings and he can fly, and then there's someone else who shoots lasers out of his eyes and he needs something special to control it.
Yeah,
There's a very big difference there.
yeah. Um, but we were also talking about it, like how certain adaptations, because we were talking about the Civil War and we were talking about the MCU Civil War,
Yeah,
and I believe one of the paths that conversation went is that we started talking about how certain adaptations end up becoming like greatest hits versions
yes,
of the stories.
yeah, because people would want to adapt the stuff that's considered to be you know really good, and so we end up with uh, like adapt in some ways that is good. Like um like the like just to talk about like for comparison, the Captain America movies, the Winter Soldier idea is a great idea, and so it gets adapted, and it's because it is generally one of the most emotional things you could do with Captain America is to have a friend from World War II return, but in very bad shape, and he has to deal with that. Um, and that's kind of like a good thing about it. But like the Civil War storyline was very popular, but partly
Yeah,
because it was just this big crossover thing that got a whole ton of stuff involved. A whole lot was put behind it, even though, in my opinion at least, the story wasn't actually very good.
yeah.
And
Civil
so
War One.
and so you come to the movie
My
where
bad.
like those two movies, I think Captain America and Winter Soldier is still one of, if not the best movie in the MCU. And I really
Yeah,
dislike Civil War. And
yeah.
I could spend hours talking about why, but they both got adapted because they were both very well known storylines in the comics.
Civil War One is interesting. It was well received when it came out. But then as m- more and more comics came out, um, and time passed, people started to realize just how much of a mess it was. Um, but it's still like a pivotal story. Like you can't really go through the Marvel universe without it because Civil War enacted a whole bunch of changes throughout pretty much all of Marvel's superhero lineup. So it was pretty much mandatory to try and adapt. Um, Now, I think personally, for the faults with the Civil War movie, I think the MCU Civil War is better than, um, the comic Civil War. Um, but that does bring up an interesting point because it's actually there is an example of a really bad story from the Marvel comics getting an adaptation because sometimes you'll have a writer in the MCU or in another adaptation who comes in and they don't just want to adapt the popular stories, they want to fix one of the bad stories. And so that gave us, and I'm not sure if you've seen it, and so if you haven't, I won't talk much more about it, but that gave us Spider-Man No Way Home.
I
And
I have seen it.
yeah, and No Way Home, it's loose, but it is at its core an adaptation of One More Day with a big sprinkling of DNA from one moment in time, but those two stories are connected.
See, I'm not entirely familiar with One More Day, but I've absolutely heard of it
Yeah.
because it has a reputation. Um, and that hadn't occurred to me before. Now that you say it, like it actually does occur to me. Yeah, that does actually map to a broad strokes of the idea. Like Spider-Man, Peter wants to use magic to fix something that went wrong in his life, and it absolutely doesn't go the way it's supposed to.
Yeah. Of
Um,
course, it is somewhat down to a difference in like the story's overall direction. Um, One More Day was made with the intention to get Peter to status quo again after Civil War and Back in Black destroyed the status quo. Um, and also, the other intention of One More Day was to break up Peter and MJ's marriage. Um,
yeah.
but the No Way Home, the intention is actually to break uh, Peter's status quo. Or that's a little
Well,
incorrect. It
it was meant to undo the last part of
of
the
Far From Home.
previous, yeah, but also, on a, I'm not sure if I would say meta level, but like in an out of universe level, it was meant to reset so that they didn't need Spider-Man for the big movies anymore because of the deal with Sony. At least I
But
thought
also,
so.
it also gets Peter Parker independent and also sort of finishes the Spider-Man origin story. Because,
Yeah,
in No Way Home, there's the with great power comes great responsibility line, yada
yeah,
yada.
which I think could have been done a little differently, but that's again that's a whole other thing.
That's a little bit of a tangent. Yeah.
Yeah, but let's see here. It was another thing with adaptions was getting to switch some things around. Like in Civil War, one of the things I noted was that I think it was a good decision for um, it was a good decision that they had Ross as the face of the government activity in that movie, so that it had to be. I think you just won again, yeah,
Yeah.
because like the behavior of the government, or in that movie, the UN, really did fit Ross's usual characterization. and I think that was a good thing because and that's one thing that adaptations can do is that they can move like knowing the full story, they can switch some characters around and put them in positions that make more sense, or pull in characters that have a matching motivation and behavior for what they're trying to do. And that's one of the good things. Like that is actually what I think one of the things that makes that movie, or I should say, the first half of that movie bearable. Second half is an entirely different story.
Yeah. But it does, and to sort of, I guess this would be kind of a tangent, but I think it's a little interesting path to go on. So if you don't mind, um,
Mhm.
uh, there is this idea. Um, it started in fan fiction spaces, of all places, although it makes sense when you hear about it. Um, but it's this idea of modern stories as mythologies. And to
Oh yeah,
sort of break that down, our concept of intellectual property is a very new concept. The modern like tradition is like from the
yeah,
17th, 18th century.
The idea of authorship is very
Before then,
different from more communal stories.
yeah, before then you had mostly communal stories. Myths, folk tales, etc. And a lot of times these communal stories they would have similar parts, but they might be changed for the regions that they're being told in.
Yeah,
Um, and so you have both sort of like official mythology, like with what the MCU does, with it, changing around the stories of, you know, these heroes in certain ways. And then of course you have unofficial mythology, uh, fan fiction, fan art, fan comics, etc.,
yeah.
which do fit a little bit more in that communal story area. Now, what do fan fiction authors do with this? They mostly use it to make men kiss, but that's besides the point.
Um, I kind of see what you mean, and that this sort of brings me back to like adaptation, which is like because the many adaptions of superhero stories, this is not like I would say this really applies to like the very popular ones, Batman, Spider-Man, Superman, who get tons of adaptions in tons of different ways that you're looking at them. Um, that kind of communal thing is still kind of there because it also brings in a bit of the depending on the author kind of treatment that I was mentioning earlier. Um, and that is one thing that becomes very interesting because certain certain versions, become incredibly popular, like Batman the Animated Series, which so many people would consider the definitive version of Batman over the many other adaptations that happen. And I do think part of that is one like even with the Batman animated series, like even it's just like with comics, people do kind of cherry pick the stuff that they think is really good. Because Batman the animated series did actually have some weaker stories in them. Where was I going with this?
I think
Sorry.
uh, you're fine, but I think that sort of brings up an interesting point because Batman the Animated Series was mostly episodic. You had a few overarching storylines throughout seasons, but for the most part, from what I remember, most episodes were self-contained because it was, you know, Saturday morning cartoon. Or well, I
Yeah.
don't think it was it Saturday AM.
I don't I don't know if it was
Uh,
actually Saturday morning, but it was meant to be that kind of thing to the point where uh, famously, the studio executives started telling them to make it more kid friendly because it
Yeah.
wasn't.
But that episodicness, I think, um, ties in to uh, the adaptation. I don't want to say problem, but the adaptation uh, ecosystem, because most fans of superheroes, they sort of subconsciously cherry pick uh, the good and the bad stories.
Oh yeah,
I mean, not even subconsciously. A lot of them do it actively because you kind of have to if you want to be a fan of comic books. Um, in comic books, all these stories are basically self-contained. Um,
yeah,
there are overarching plots, but a lot of it will just end up being undone.
yeah,
And
yeah.
your
There's a reason
favorite
why so
character,
many people, when they make recommendations, will usually preface recommendations by saying, uh, "This author, this author's run, like this set done by this author artist combination,"
yeah,
like all the time. And
yeah,
yeah, it is because of that. Because like that's kind of different authors have different ideas. They have different things they emphasize. They have different way they portray the characters. Like even the same author will have very different uh, ways they tell a story. Like I think very famous, like Frank Miller wrote some amazing Batman stories and then wrote what is usually the most mocked Batman story.
that happened recently too with the Spider-Man comics. I think you may have heard of the some of the stuff around Paul, um, and
You did tell me a bit about that.
yeah, uh, but Paul was a character introduced by Zeb Wells, and a lot of people really hated Zeb Wells' run. But before that, um, Zeb Wells had written some really good Spider-Man runs. Um, it was only because it's not just about author, it's also about editorial, which is unfortunate.
Yeah,
Uh, and that's again another
that's a whole other bag of
yeah. Um, but like I was saying, that episodicness, people are cherry picking uh which stories they feel are true representations of these characters. And so you end up with a lot of these different versions of these characters running around. And as I was saying, that's kind of necessary to be a fan of comics because pretty much everybody's favorite character has had, been ruined essentially at one point or another. The most recent example being Carol Danvers fans in the comics. Um, Carol Danvers, Captain Marvel, very recently had well, not very recently, but recent enough, um, had the Civil War II comics event. Um, really bad character assassination for her character. Um, and people who weren't, you know, uh, Captain Marvel fans, for a lot of them, that is their impression of the character is Civil War II.
so where I was going to go with this is that adaptions, by their nature of kind of being these cherry picked ideas, sort of have this result where adaptions can, by choosing what they're emphasizing, by choosing what stories they want to run, can get a consistency or I'd almost use the word distillation of a character or their idea as part of a story. And admittedly, because I've mostly uh, seen superheroes through adaptions, I do sort of see this as a positive thing, but I'm curious if you would.
Um, I think yes. I think it is good. Oh, I shouldn't have done that. That you know, the MCU doesn't have to deal with uh, you know,
Every retcon.
I'm trying to. Yeah, they don't have to deal with, writers who just end up getting assigned to a character, but they actually, like hate the character. Um,
Oh,
you don't have to deal with writers who just fundamentally don't understand the characters. Um, Infamous example, comics community was discussing Old Man Logan, which is a series of comics
yeah.
about Wolverine in the post-apocalypse, um, which features, and I won't go too much into detail, um, a very poorly written version of Hulk. Um, Hulk is kind of the poster child for that
Oh, yeah,
behavior.
yeah. Because some people will
Um,
treat him as a villain, and some people will treat him as a either tragic monster or a Jekyll Hyde type figure.
it's also just um, Hulk kind of has like an editorial mandate to always be suffering.
It's
A lot of Hulk
like
stories are, to put it lightly, misery porn.
I say, I thought that was also Spider-Man, but I guess
That's
Spider-Man
also
also has
Spider-Man
to
at this
sometimes
point.
be kid friendly because they want the kids to come see his stuff. But yeah, I see what you mean. Um, I
But
think
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
no, you go ahead.
Um, but that does bring up an interesting point with how the MCU is now. You know, how much will Marvel Studios be able to maintain that consistency? Is, I think, a question to be asked because the MCU is approaching like what, phase five, and
Yeah, and
over.
I do think it has started reaching like some of that issue, like this, like kind of the same issue that the comics themselves get, which is one of the things I was going to get to, which because there's become so much of it that keeping it all tied together consistently has become what would be someone's full-time job, which the MCU had someone who was doing that early on, and as far as I know, he doesn't actually. I don't know if he actually does that anymore. I'd have to check.
uh,
Um, but like, yeah, if you aren't keeping up with any of the, if you aren't keeping up with all of them, you feel like you're being left out, even if like if you write them right, you won't end up being left out, but you can end up feeling like it anyway.
yeah.
Um, which of course is also part of how I kind of fell out after I wouldn't say not necessarily Endgame, but a little after that.
Yeah. I mean, I
Um,
think most people would describe Endgame as the point where they kind of got out because realistically, the MCU kind of should have just ended at Endgame. I mean, everybody had, pretty much the perfect ending.
I don't think it really needed to. I think it had needed to have. Hmm, I think it needed to slow itself down for a while and have like almost a soft reboot, but not not a real reboot. The continuity isn't changing. It's just like everything slows down and we get reacquainted with what the status quo is going to be now. But
Yeah,
I feel like they were rushing into what they were doing next
yeah,
because they want to go back to having big blockbusters, and they weren't going to have that until they had another core cast set up like they did with those original six. the
Yeah.
original six Avengers, who were all done very well, very consistently. And I think that was a big part of what made it work.
Yeah. I mean, it's I talked about this over text chat. But to sort of reiterate the point, um, every corporation in the history of time has been obsessed with the idea of the eternal product.
Yeah.
Um, Something that you can sell to a consumer over and over and over again.
Yep.
Um, and even though these movies, the MCU, cost millions of dollars in special effects, actor, payment because you got to get the A-listers, all that, you know, they've proven, you know, that they can, how do I want to say this? They've proven they're profitable.
Yeah.
Um, Even some of the least liked movies ended up making back bank. And so, as long as they stay that way, they're going to try and find a way to keep these storylines going. Sorry, I got a little tongue-tied there, trying to
No, that's fair.
focus.
Um, but I don't want to go end up going off into like the actual business stuff.
Yeah,
But I would say to keep this kind of neighborhood of talking about adaptions. Do I? Trying to
I
think of a
mean,
way to.
if we wanted to talk about adaptions, um, we could talk about how a lot of people, because people know superheroes, but
Yeah,
most people aren't really, reading comics anymore. Um, for a multitude of reasons between quality, um, accessibility, etc., etc. So most people will be getting their ideas of these superheroes through adaptions. And that is kind of almost a negative for the actual original source material because a
yeah,
lot of times the source material, I didn't even realize you make a move. Did you?
I did.
Okay. Um, but for a lot of people, um, that uh, adaptation will usually have a lot of like severe differences from, you know, the comics. Um, to give you again another MCU example, uh, Spider-Man is usually supposed to be friends with the Fantastic Four, not Tony Stark. I
Yeah,
don't even know how many times Tony Stark and Peter Parker even actually interact in uh the comics because I think it just usually. I mean, I know Peter's been an Avenger before, and they definitely like have interacted, but usually, um, Peter's hanging around with Reed or Johnny Storm, and so that's people will open a comic book expecting find that kind of thing, but instead they have to sit around watch the Fantastic Four, who because the Fantastic Four have been kind of shafted cinematically.
yeah.
Um, Most people don't have a familiarity with.
Yeah,
Um,
that is definitely one thing because like a lot of I think and I told you this before. A lot of my knowledge of the comics actually comes secondhand from my father, who was a big comic fan. So even growing up, we would be told several times, like, oh, but in the comics this was different. Especially true for Batman and the X-Men, which were my dad's favorites.
yeah. Um, Another good example, uh, you got Hank Pym, who
Oh,
in the
yeah,
comics was the creator of Ultron, but uh, and the MCU it's Tony Stark, and that's actually a surprisingly controversial decision, because for a lot of people they consider that as sort of integral to Hank's character.
yeah, and I do understand that one. Like I on both sides of it, because like I assume that ever since the creation of Ultron, uh, it has been like a major motivating factor of Hank Pym, and so like it doesn't work to leave that out, especially when they did get around to bringing him in, and like it, they had to give him a different backstory and
Yeah.
remove um, Janet. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Um, well, some of Janet's removal, I think so. This is kind of a tangent. I think the reason the MCU wanted to skip straight to Scott Lang as Ant-Man is because they wanted to avoid the baggage of Hank Pym's character, not just as creator of Ultron, but if you don't know, there's a very infamous storyline with
I
Ant-Man.
I do think I know where this is going actually.
Yeah, the Ant-Man hits his wife.
Yeah, which is in like because I do think I read about this like there's this whole thing of like it's like it's supposed to be a primary example of something that happens several times in comics where a character is either mind controlled or they're semi mind like something happens to them, and the point is that they're not in their right mind, and then they do something in that, and people forget the first part of it, and like this is supposed to be like one of the things Hank Pym like there's something messing with him that was making him just angry for that whole story arc, and that was supposed to be like a genuinely part of the story arc was like something's messing with Hank, and like this is supposed to be like the point that proves that oh, this is out of character for Hank. He wouldn't do this, so there must be something else going on. But people only remember that he hit Janet.
Yeah,
I think that's happened
it's
with like several characters, and like it's a whole. I think like TV tropes has like a whole big page about stuff like that. But you know, it doesn't. But the point being, like people remember only the controversial part of it instead of why it happened.
yeah.
Which
Um,
I don't know. Like that could say something about the writing quality, maybe. But
well, actually, the thing about it is, um, Hank Pym hits Janet Van Dyne, and that label kind of followed him for like ever. Um, but the thing about it is, like, people actually do kind of regard that story as a decently written story. Um, and as a counterpoint, there are some examples in very early Spider-Man runs where Peter hits Mary Jane. Um, those stories never lasted. Um, and they never had a lasting effect. Not only because A, they were poorly written, but B, they also didn't have lasting repercussions for the character inside or outside of the story. And I apologize for this, but I do have to step away from the keyboard for 5 minutes.
Okay.
Alrighty, I'm sorry to make you do more editing work, but I got interrupted.
No, that's fine. So, something I did think about while we were gone, concerning those kind of out of character moments, whether they're part of a good story or bad story, that's something that you can more or less just remove in adaptations. In fact, with shorter adaptations like film, you really don't want your main character to spend much, if any, time acting out of character. Certainly not enough time to do it like slowly, like to try and make it mysterious. You could do it in the like TV show adaptations when you have more time to work with, but you know stuff like that you want to put in the films because not just for sake of avoiding controversy, but because you have a very short amount of time, relatively speaking, to sell the character, and the more time that they're not acting like themselves, that's less time you've got to work with. Like, um, gonna stick with the MCU in Age of Ultron, when the characters get uh, messed with by Scarlet Witch, it just doesn't last very long. So you don't really have to. So you don't have to work on that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think also a good example is in Infinity War, you had the infamous Star-Lord scene. Um, you know, it's not just you don't want to dedicate the time to uh characters acting out of character, but also because in a film, as compared to a comic book or even a written work, sometimes the intent of a scene can be lost on audiences
Yeah,
because for like years after Infinity War came out, you'd have people screaming, "Oh my God, Star-Lord's so dumb. Why did he do that? He ruined everything."
because
Even though
he's
the whole point,
emotionally compromised. That's the
yeah,
like like you probably wouldn't be acting very sane if you were just told that the person you were in love with was dead.
not only dead but killed by her own father,
Yeah,
and her own father is, the man you hate most in the entire universe. Literally an apocalyptic entity.
yeah. Speaking of people not understanding a character, there's a whole
Yeah,
thing with Thanos. Like, no, guys, he wasn't supposed to sound sane. He thinks he does. Like
yeah.
that's kind of the point of the characters. Like, he thinks he's sane, but that doesn't mean you should be listening to him. I mean,
Thanos is another kind of example of
yeah, because like in the comics,
adaptations.
like if I remember correctly, in the comics, he's a fairly generic, like just straightforward evil villain. Like
Well,
it's not complicated. He likes to kill
also
people.
in the MCU, Thanos is like he's insane, but there's like a method to his madness.
Yeah,
He has some kind of rationality, behind it. It's not sound rationality, but it is, some kind of justification. Thanos in the comics does what he does because he's trying to get laid. Um, he's trying to bang death.
yeah, and
It's
he's an inherently selfish motivation. That's what makes him a villain.
yeah.
Oh, that was bad. That was a bad move.
Uh,
But
I mean, it's not bad. It's just not optimal.
but um yeah. So yeah, it brings back to, like, as I said, like cherry picking things about characters to make them consistent, which like can lead to a more consistent and better flowing story, I should say. Like as I said, I haven't actually read many comics myself. What I have are generally very celebrated, highly regarded stuff. I've read Batman Year One, The Dark Knight Returns. I've read The Killing Joke and The Long Halloween, all of which are not just highly praised works from that have managed last time, but they're also like very specifically, I believe the word is serialized, like or
Yeah.
no, but like it is very specifically they started a story and the entire point is to tell this specific story without getting bogged down with other continuity things. Even though all of those, well, except the Dark Knight Returns, have kind of just become accepted as like the de facto canon, at least to my knowledge.
I'd also say in the case of Thanos, it's not the case of it's not just a case of trying to maintain a consistent storyline, but also a consistent tone, because
Yeah,
it absolutely would not work in the MCU if Thanos came down and was like, "Yeah, I'm doing this because I want to get, I want to get that
can't even
Dusty."
can't even say it. Can't even say it with a straight face.
Yeah. Um. Yeah. It's also not just consistency, but a lot of creators and writers and directors, they see some of these characters as vessels for certain stories that they want to tell. Um, I, I can't. Well, I mean, I can't think of an example off the top of my head. Civil War, uh, made in the uh after not yeah aftermath, I guess is the good word. Aftermath of the Patriot Act passing. You know,
Yeah,
so we need to have
like
certain characters act as mouthpieces for certain viewpoints. Um,
yeah,
Now, as that applies to adaptations, you have adaptations like uh, trying to think because I'm actually kind of in the opposite boat of you. I've read, a bunch of comics. I
yeah,
haven't actually watched many of the movies. Um, um, I guess like you can consider it like Batman v Superman, sort of how you know Snyder wanted that man versus God, and so he
yeah,
sort of twisted Batman and Superman into these characters such that he could get that final
yeah.
result.
And as far as trying to work with the idea of man versus God, it was a very poor showing. Mostly because those characters aren't meant to do that. They're both very different ideas. Batman is a broken person trying to, in the more optimistic interpretations, trying to make sure no one else has to go through his pain, and in the least optimistic interpretations, is trying to force the world into his own idea. While Superman is an idealized, an idealized everyman almost.
Yeah,
Like I think I've seen someone say, like point out, like uh, an optimist thinks that if you gave an ordinary person Superman's powers, he'd become Superman. A pessimist thinks if you gave an ordinary person Superman's powers, he'd become Homelander,
yeah.
which
Um,
is which I do think is like the entire point of Superman. Like you have a man who can do anything, he chooses to do good. What does that look like? What does he
I
struggle
do,
with?
I do think that what you said about interpretation is also a good topic of discussion because you know, a lot of writers also have different thoughts on what a character symbolizes. And as someone who's more familiar with Marvel, I'll throw up Spider-Man as an example. Spider-Man, in his again doing the most optimistic, most pessimistic interpretation, and the most optimistic interpretations of Spider-Man, he's an everyman guy who realized that he had the power to help people, and so he does it. Um, but there's also some interesting interpretations of Spider-Man where it's like he's haunted by the fact that he had the power to save his uncle, but he couldn't. And so that leads him into this self-destructive idea of I have to save, everyone I can. If not, I'm failing.
Yeah, and
And,
that is
and
a very familiar interpretation that some people put forward for
yeah,
Batman.
and it puts in
Honestly,
that
for several
interpretation.
superheroes, like that specific thing, I couldn't save somebody and now I try to save everybody, like is a very common thing. And to what degree it's present depends on which superhero you're talking about.
Yeah, I think Spider-Man gets it a lot more than most. Because I think um it really depends on how you interpret the great power, great responsibility line. Um,
Hmm.
some people interpret it as a simple if you can do, but some people interpret it as like this self-destructive, you know, throw like you don't deserve to have a break or anything because you have these powers. And so if somebody gets hurt while you're not there to protect
Yeah,
them, that's on you.
yeah, and certainly that again, that's something you can do that can be more or less interesting with adaptions. Is how are you going to look at that? How are you going to examine this thing? But again, you get to take an adaptation and you get to do it consistently. It doesn't have to be in line with how other writers would have interpreted it, which could lead to character acting differently at different points.
Yeah.
Um,
You do think we might be approaching the upper limit.
yeah,
Um,
we've been at this for a while now.
what's the recording timer at if you have one?
1 second. An hour, actually.
Uh, I mean, yeah, I think we've got an hour. It's
Yeah.
I did good.
Um, there's something I had intended to ask but hadn't yet. Um,
Good.
what adaptions are there adaptions? What I want to figure out like what other adaptions we have in common other than just the MCU. Is there
Um, well, MCU, um, Raimi Spider-Man
the
movies.
Raimi's? Yeah, I've seen them. I
Um,
actually it's interesting. I've seen the first one, but I've only ever seen bits and pieces of the other two. Despite how much praise the second one gets, I don't think I've ever actually sat down and just watched through the whole
it
thing.
it's been so long since I watched any of them, so my memories of them are a little vague outside of the big moments. Um, but MCU Raimi Spider-Man movies. Um, I grew up in the time of, Dark Knight Rises, Nolan Batman movies. So I have memories of those times. Um, but it's been a long time since I have watched any of those. Um, also cartoons, Batman the Animated Series. What else? Spectacular Spider-Man?
Haven't seen it.
Unfortunate. Um, I mean, what else of the DC animated universe have you watched?
The Justice League series.
Yeah, Justice
Um,
League
I
Unlimited.
saw some of Static Shock growing up. Um,
I unfortunately missed out on the Static Shock train.
I
It
also
it's
missed out on Batman Beyond. Like I think when I was a kid, I didn't
I
think
remember
much of it.
watching Batman Beyond as a kid, and
Um,
it's still one of my favorite versions of Batman.
yeah. Since then, I've basically watched a lot of video essays that talk about the DCAU and especially Batman Beyond, and I do kind of wish I had because apparently it's actually a really good sort of uh, coda on BTAS.
You are Maiden too, by the way.
Okay. Oh yeah, I see it. Yep, you got me. You've got me.
Oh, is that not it? Oh, I messed it up.
Oh,
Okay.
you messed it up. Oh man. But
I
as far as I'm concerned, you won.
yeah. Uh,
I don't know if I can come back from this. I'm really out of practice. Um, Teen Titans, although that's not
oh yeah. Uh,
DCAU.
I mean it's tech by all
Uh,
technicalities.
yes and no.
Um,
Like like the show itself, Teen Titans can fit in with the DCAU, but the DCAU kind of can't fit with the Teen Titans.
yeah. But I did watch Teen Titans growing up. I've never actually read any of the Teen Titans
Neither
comics.
have I.
Um,
It's,
I mean, I just also don't read DC stuff that often,
yeah,
so that is a part of it.
my father was a
Um,
big fan of mainly Batman and the X-Men, so I've seen a lot of Batman comics. My dad had a by the time that I was reading any of it, it was a very uh, kind of like a sort of like a shotgun of different comics that were just not complete storylines and just incomplete pieces. But there was a lot of X-Men stuff, like the different related teams, like X Factor, Excalibur. I think like the closest we could come to finding a full arc was like a three connected issues of Excalibur, and that was it. Those were fun
um,
enough, though.
uh, I need to do is I just need to get the other
Yeah,
book.
I mean, I don't know how to concede in this game, or I would because I can't actually win this.
Yeah. Uh, I'm trying to end it. I messed up my ending.
Yeah, with the queen.
I know.
But
Uh,
I also would recommend uh the Arkham games. You know,
yeah. Okay. There it goes. I didn't even
there it
realize that
is.
was mate.
Yeah. Um, but glad you were willing to do this with me.
Yeah.
I don't know how interesting this will be to watch for other people,
Eh,
but
it,
I was
it
happy to
was.
talk to you about superheroes for a good long
Yeah.
while.